projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 18, Screams of Laughter, in which Jim Reed and I waste no time in getting into the Halloween spirit by chatting with today's guest about classic horror comedies. So, lower the lights and...
By the way, if you should hear noises, ignore them. They're nothing. Nothing at all.
Mr. Grooch, our attorney. These men are going to help us find Grandfather.
Oh, really? Well, then I suppose you'll want to search for clues. Would you rather start where the ghostly white figures were seen or where we found the pool of blood?
Oh, wait a minute. Where are you going? I got to go back to the office. I forgot something. What'd you forget? I forgot to stay there.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. Since the earliest days of motion pictures, filmmakers have sought to replicate the same sort of audience reactions previously mined by authors of literary works or productions presented theatrically. Two of the most popular forms of this have been comedy and horror. Occasionally, the two approaches cross paths, and contemporary audiences will be immediately reminded of films such as Ghostbusters, Killer Clowns from Outer Space, and more recently, Renfield, featuring Nick Cage as Dracula. Here to talk with me and Jim about many of the movies that laid the groundwork for the current crop of horror comedies is Paul Castiglia, who has documented and reviewed many of the classics in his blog, Scared Silly, which is also the basis for his forthcoming book of the same name. Welcome aboard once again, Jim, and Paul, welcome to Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
Our pleasure. At least I think I speak for Jim.
And Jim.
I don't want to be presumptuous. Okay, good. All right. Now, you've got an interesting background approaching this project. So before we get into the subject itself, then why don't you give us kind of a thumbnail rundown of the kind of interesting things that you've done?
Oh, sure. Well, you know, I'm known as a writer and editor of comic books for many years, and I've also done some animation writing. And it's through those types of efforts that I was able to take some of my love for horror comedy, which we'll talk about how I got there in a moment. But I'm known for writing the Archie's Weird Mysteries comic book series for Archie, which put those characters into spooky situations. I also wrote some Thomas the Train shorts for Mattel, animated shorts that put him into outlandish situations with, a giant sea monster and the like. So I've been able to take kind of this love of horror comedy and put it into a career. And, as a sideline, I do this film history type of stuff. I've been speaking at classic film screenings for a number of years. I have this Scared Silly blog and book project. I also contributed an essay to a book on Vincent Price. It was a collection of essays, and we got to choose our subjects. So I chose the comedic films that Price made with Peter Lorre. So things like Tales of Terror and Comedy of Terrors and The Raven, which I hope to also feature in my Scared Silly book. I'm still
the Roger Corman stuff.
So it's kind of intertwined, and I credit a lot of that to a fellow named George Erling, who was an underground cartoonist who lived in my town where I grew up in New Jersey, and he worked at the town library. And not only did he give cartooning classes where I learned how to draw comics, but he also ordered all the materials for the library, which included a vast array of 8mm and Super 8 films, all kinds of classic comedies, including We Want Our Mummy, which is a Three Stooges short where they meet a mummy. He had old-time radio there on cassette and on record vinyl. He had books galore on all these topics: classic films, classic comedians, animation, comic books. So a lot of that was stoked by that library in my town. And I only recently found out, actually, this past summer, that George was the guy who ordered that stuff. I always suspected it, but I was out to dinner with him and some friends, and I asked him point blank. I said, "Hey, I've been meaning to ask you this for years. Did you order all that?" He said, "Oh yeah." He said neighboring towns people would come from neighboring towns just to get this material because it wasn't available elsewhere. So a little bit of a digression there, but
we do that a lot here.
Yeah, but that kind of stoked it. So I'm going to rewind a little bit. So the reason that I got into the whole horror comedy thing was because I was scared as a little kid. I was scared of three things in particular, and two of them were practically the same. But I was scared of the Joker on reruns of the Batman show, the 1966 Adam West show where Cesar Romero played the Joker. I was scared of him. I was scared of the Frankenstein monster in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein because I latched on to both Laurel and Hardy and Abbott and Costello around the age of 4 or 5. But when that one came on, I'd run out of the room. And then, by extension, I was afraid of Herman Munster, who was very much made up to look like that kind of Glenn Strange Frankenstein that appeared in the Abbott and Costello movie. So I think it was always in me. And I think as I became a teenager, I wanted to explore these things and why I was afraid of them and kind of confront them head on. And then I got to see some of the humor in it, but by then I'd already loved Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and all that, horror comedy stuff. But I think that was kind of the genesis of me figuring out why am I scared and can I make light of it and have fun with it. And so, as I've done my research, you come to find that psychologists will tell you there's a very thin line between laughing and screaming. And that's why in a lot of legitimate horror movies, you have some kind of comedic moment, comic relief moment to relieve the tension, because it is that fine line of release. So I wanted to explore all of these things I loved in the Scared Silly Project, having grown up loving Laurel and Hardy and Abbott and Costello and the Three Stooges and so many more. I mean, those are kind of the heavy hitters. And realizing, wow, they all got involved in spooky stuff a lot. And then as you come to learn of other comedians like Hugh Herbert or Leon Errol, or just name anybody, Wheeler and Woolsey, Olsen and Johnson, you find out, wow, they got into spooky stuff too.
Remember Abbott and Costello and the whole that goes? The whole thing turned out to be gangsters. That was a very unbelievable picture. Yeah, especially when that candle started moving back and forth in front of Costello. Like that.
And it's a lot. There's a ton of these films, feature films and shorts that get involved with putting funny people into scary situations. And they kind of fall into a few categories. One would be what I would call the old dark house category, where it's the characters are in a spooky situation. Typically, it's the reading of a will. It's these tropes that came out of famous plays and novels, in stage plays. Somebody's trying to scare them out of the will. It's kind of something that ends up becoming the whole raison d'etre for Scooby-Doo, right? So there's those, but then there's ones where the funny characters meet actual real monsters. A lot of people will make a distinction and say, well, the old dark house one is really a mystery comedy. The ones with real monsters are horror comedies. But for me, they're all, as long as they're spooky, they're all horror comedies. And it runs the gamut. You get your type of Frankenstein monsters or your werewolves or your vampires, but then you get things like haunted lighthouses. There's like a few movies where somehow it's on the dock, it's at the bay, it's on a ship, and there's something spooky there. There's a few of those. So there's just all different types of monsters and things that come into play. It just fascinates me.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of those, or at least one common theme that I've noticed in a number of films, is that you'll have a so-called haunted house and it's covering for some nefarious activity going on in the basement, criminals or spies or things like that.
That happened a lot. Ghost on the Loose,
which I just watched.
East Side Kids, yeah. So that one, it's Bela Lugosi, but they're Nazis and they're printing up Nazi propaganda. When you stop and apply logic to it, you're like, why would they go to this ruse of having to scare these meddling kids away?
Stop acting like a couple of hysterical dames.
Who's acting like hysterical dames? I saw it in school and saw it too, didn't you?
Nothing else but. Come on, let's go home.
I ought to slug the both of you. You're imagining things. It's all in your mind.
Now, whose mind is that in?
They could have gotten rid of him much easier than going through some kind of elaborate hoax, but then you wouldn't have the comedy and the fun. So
yeah. And going back, you mentioned the influence on you of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. As I recall, Jim, years ago, before I had ever seen it, you were telling me how great that one was. So that's kind of the high watermark, I guess, of this genre.
When I was, I'm tell a little story here. When I was probably from the time I was like 6 or 7 years old on, I would spend every summer over at a recreation center swimming all day. Hinthorn Recreation Center. You probably remember that.
I learned to swim there.
Yeah. And I can remember when I was a little kid, they made an announcement that at 2:00 they were going to have a movie in the auditorium. And I remember sitting on that cold cement floor in a wet bathing suit, watching Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Come on, you fraidy cat. These things can't harm you. They're made out of wax. You know, people pay McDougal cash to come in here and get scared.
I'm cheating them. I'm getting scared for nothing.
And as I watched it, I kept looking back at the projector and I was like, oh, there's actual film. And that was kind of the moment that I fell in love with film. And I started collecting film, not long after that. So that film always has had a special place for me.
That's a great story. And it is, without question, it is the undisputed greatest classic horror comedy film of all time for a number of reasons. Obviously, Abbott and Costello being at Universal got to play with the Universal monsters. So that helped right there. But also, it's become pretty common knowledge now among film aficionados. But, I think we took it for granted for many years that in that film, the monsters mostly play it straight. And the antics of Abbott and Costello playing off against that is what makes that work so beautifully.
Yeah. Lon Chaney Jr. being as tormented as ever as Larry Talbot.
Yeah, that's a combination, too, of my two real passions as far as film goes are classic comedy and the Universal horror films. So, I mean, they come together perfectly there.
Yeah. Now, we talk about that being, again, kind of the high watermark, really setting the standard. But as I mentioned in the intro, the blend of comedy and horror goes all the way back to the silence. I would say earliest silence. I think even in the films of Georges Méliès, he's got some imagery that is really scary, but he's also got a lot of silliness going on. So
absolutely,
he meshed those right there at the beginning.
He is the architect right from the beginning, for sure. He's the one. And I guess maybe he pulled that over from stage, because he was a stage magician. And it also has stage origins. I mean, you can go back to Shakespeare and see the mix of, horrific elements with some humor. But through the years, different stage plays and different forms like music hall and vaudeville. In fact, there's a number of routines in Hold That Ghost, another Abbott and Costello film, that evolved out of several different vaudeville routines. And some of them were pretty morbid, but they were played for laughs. So yeah, Méliès for sure figured out how to do that. And then there were other creative talents at the time in the silent movie era that were latching on to that. J. Stewart Blackton was primarily an animator, an early pioneer. And he has a number of films in the early 1900s, around 1907, 1908, where he used kind of stop motion, live action animated tricks to create spooky situations. One was called The Haunted Hotel. And I believe there's one, I'm going to forget the title now. I think it's The Disembodied Hand, or at least that's what you see in the film. If it's not called that, that's at least what you see in the film. And so they were kind of scary, yet they were also funny. I always tell audiences who would say about these classic horror comedies, well, they're not really all that scary now to us. And I say, well, you have to understand, for someone like Méliès working back then, a great example is The Great Train Robbery, the Edison film, right? So when people saw that and they saw the train coming at them, they ducked because they had never seen that before. So to them, it was real. So all these things that were put on screen, people weren't saying, "Oh, that's fake" or "that can't happen." To them, it was a real thing happening, and so it rattled them a bit. And it also made them laugh when it was resolved. The hero won at the end, or whatever the story was. They would get a good chuckle. They were taken on an amusement park ride, so to speak. And I think horror comedies do that really well when they're well made.
Yeah, I think because I was just going into my own head here and trying to come up with a sense of what makes them effective, what gives them their appeal. And I wonder if, at least for some people, it's probably too general to universally say that, everybody likes to be scared to some extent. But I think probably most people do in some fashion. And I think maybe for people who are not going to do well with a straight horror film, if it's a horror comedy, it gives them that element of separation where they can see the scary thing, but you're focused on the characters in the film reacting to it. So it's them being scared and in funny ways. So it buffers it a little bit. And
it absolutely buffers it. And also there is that kind of comfort that you can have in seeing a recognizable figure. If we consider some of the other silent horror comedies that came along before sound came in, you have a film like Harold Lloyd's Haunted Spooks, or you have a film like Buster Keaton's The Haunted House.
Mm-hmm.
And people were so used to Lloyd and Keaton by now, they were like friends of theirs. You would go to, it's my old friend Buster again. And, you knew they were going to come out on top. You were anxious for them while they were going through the peril of whatever the scary situation was, but you knew they were going to come out on top. And I think there's something to that as well.
Yeah. And going a little bit further into the silent era, and in terms of feature films, you have something like The Monster with Lon Chaney, which is kind of an oddball film of Lon Chaney's in that it does have a quirkiness, a humorous element to it, which, you didn't get that in most Chaney films.
No, you didn't. And that is one I still have yet to watch, but it's on my list because you're not the first person to bring that up to me. So, and I even wrote a little bit about it on my blog, but I will be watching that and considering that for the book.
And then one of the more famous ones, and you mentioned the Old Dark House formula. Well, The Cat and the Canary is kind of the classic there, and that has that blend of horror and horror, suspense, mystery, and humor.
Plus, it gave us the wonderful body falling out of the closet routine.
Yes, for sure. And like I was saying earlier, there's different stage plays and books that are really influential here. There was Mary Roberts Reinhardt play, The Bat.
I was just thinking about The Bat.
There's The Gorilla, which became a movie. They all became movies. And sometimes they were done straight with comic relief, and sometimes they were just all out horror comedies. Cat and the Canary certainly falls into that. It's definitely the sound remake with Bob Hope, for sure. Earl Durr Biggers, who created Charlie Chan, has the book
7 Keys to Baldpate.
Yes, you get a lot of those tropes in there. You have to have the inheritance. You have to stay the night. There's secret panels. There's all kinds of things going up in the night, spooky things. A lot of that type of stuff starts there as well. And it all kind of feeds in. These things weren't happening in a vacuum. They were all inspiring each other. And newspaper comic strips, too. They were taking advantage of throwing in some spooky elements here and there as well, but played for laughs.
Yeah. So we've talked about going back to the silent era, but then working forward now, how far forward does your book cover?
Well, honestly, as far as the silence, I was going to try to cover as many of the silence as I could until I realized there was way too many of them and most of them were lost. And so, I had to, over the past year, kind of make some hard decisions about what to include and what to not include. So as far as the silence, I'm going to give an overview to talk about, how it all began and how it all fed into what came later. But as far as reviewing all the films, no, I have to review things like Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton, obviously, and Laurel and Hardy. They have a couple silent entries that fit. and Our Gang, of course. But I can't give full reviews on every single silent, or else
right,
the book will never be finished. But
what's your cutoff date?
Well, my cutoff is going to be 1966, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken with Don Knotts.
Ah, well, that's an appropriate one.
Do you believe in ghosts?
Oh, you ought to know better than to ask that, Chief.
The supernatural doesn't bother you.
Not a speck.
Do haunted houses scare you?
They're mortar, stone, and wood.
Well, good, because you're going to spend the murder night in the Simmons house alone.
Oh, well, now, just a second.
What's the matter, Ace? You scared?
Oh, well, heck no. You kidding? It's just that I got to check my bowling schedule and everything.
I think it's the final of what I would call the purest of the Golden Age horror comedies. And even with that, it has a scene where there's a little bit of blood trickling, which may or may not be real. It's a spoiler alert. I don't want to give it away. But, what happens after that, it's kind of, you can make a kind of line of demarcation between The Ghost and Mr. Chicken and Spider Baby, which followed. I think it was filmed maybe a year later, but I think it didn't come out for another 2 or 3 years. And in that film with Lon Chaney Jr. and Mantan Moreland, it was very dark. It was as if someone said, we want to make an Addams Family film, but make it really disturbing and dark and a little more grisly. And so all of a sudden, the horror comedy is upended by violence and by sexuality, the traditional horror comedy. From then on, things like The Fearless Vampire Killers or even Young Frankenstein, Ghostbusters, they will have more PG or PG-13 elements in them.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to keep it in the squirrely, family-friendly zone. Not that I have anything against the other types of films. I'm a big fan of 1980s horror comedy films, and those, are mostly all R-rated. But I just have a particular reverence and appreciation for these kind of classic era films that you could take the whole family to. And I feel that the real last gasp of that is The Ghost of Mr. Chicken.
Yeah. And it's interesting because thinking about that just reminded me of one of my earliest memories of seeing something that scared me. And we're talking about TV, but it's Don Knotts, because there was an episode of the Andy Griffith Show where a moonshine operation was undercover of a haunted house. And I remember being really creeped out by some of what I saw in that episode. And so then seeing, it's like Ghost of Mr. Chicken was sort of the big screen version of that episode in a way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that also had to do with the world outside of Fantasyland of entertainment, because, there were a lot of haunted house episodes of TV situation comedies up through the end of the 1960s. But when the real life horrors of presidents and presidential candidates and Martin Luther King getting assassinated and the Vietnam War conflict,
Charles Manson,
and riots, and all kinds of the upheaval of the late 60s into the early 1970s, the real life horrors became so frightening, I think, that it kind of
haunted houses became quaint.
Yeah, quaint. That's a good word for it. I wrote an essay about it on the blog called The Old Dark Anachronism, where I talked about that. And I think that's also part of it. So I'm really kind of trying to capture that time where, even though we know the world and the country was never completely innocent, the entertainment was more innocent.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to capture that kind of time between the 1920s and the mid 60s before everything flipped.
Right. Okay. Well, we talked about, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and you mentioned some others in passing. And that was really a common element of a lot of the comedy teams and groups, whether it's, Laurel and Hardy, Our Gang, Three Stooges, Bowery Boys, et cetera. What are some of the more standout films among those?
Well, for me, if you're talking about teams, I love Laurel and Hardy. They're my all-time favorites. And they have a number of shorts where they get mixed up in spooky situations. I'll highlight one in particular, and then I want to talk a little bit about something else with them. But the one that I really love is The Live Ghost. And again, it's one of these ones that takes place at sea. So it's kind of the horror comedy offshoot at sea, right? So in this one, they're part of a Shanghai crew on a boat. And they're actually the ones who helped Shanghai, the crew members. And the captain is upset that everybody refers to his boat as a ghost ship. And he says,
"If anybody ever mentions ghosts to me again, I'll take his head and I'll twist it around so that when he's walking north, he'll be looking south. Do you get me?"
Anyway, complications ensue. Laurel and Hardy think they've seen a real ghost. And Stan Laurel does this amazing take where this drunk character that they think they've killed, they throw him overboard, thinking that they've accidentally shot him. And he's fallen into some whitewash. He comes back onto the boat and he falls in the whitewash. And Stan sees him. And it's this shot of Stan looking out the cabin door, seeing this guy stumbling around, completely white, looking like a ghost, closing the door as if nothing's happened, then opening it again and having this amazing scare take that just makes me laugh every time I see it. So with Laurel and Hardy, they were prone to getting scared anyway. So that was just a great short for me. You know, I grew up in New Jersey and we got television out of New York City. And every Thanksgiving, they would show Babes in Toyland, also known as March of the Wooden Soldiers,
right,
which is kind of more like a fantasy fairy tale comedy, but it has so many creepy elements to it that it's just about a horror comedy in a lot of respects. The bogeymen, just kind of creepy things. So I'll be talking about that in the book just because it's just such a pillar of a lot of people's childhoods. And when you look at it through that light of some of the scariness and weirdness of it, it can really creep you out. But, you know, beyond them, the Stooges, I think the Stooges probably did more horror comedies than anybody. They made so many shorts. They have a ton. And a lot of the shorts that they did with Shemp later on, they started doing like cut and paste jobs, where Columbia was trying to fill a quota of shorts every year. So they would start using stock footage from prior shorts and building new shorts around it. So maybe you'd have a 16-minute short where, if you were lucky, 5 to 8 minutes of it was new. And all the scary stuff of them running around was kind of reused footage.
Yeah,
so
I read that the budget on the Stooges films at the end of the 50s was the same budget that they started with in 1934.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. Columbia was just trying to make money off of them. So however cheaply they could put those films together and make a profit. But, you know, they endured, you know, they hung on the longest. And so even when they got around to Joe Besser, by that time, they have Joe Besser as third stooge in the mid-1950s. And there are more outer space alien invasion UFO movies in movie theaters. So they end up doing 3 shorts with Besser that are kind of outer space themed. And to me, those kind of fall into the horror comedy category. And then when they start doing features with Joe DeRita, the same thing. They do a few of those. In fact, they have one movie where they actually mixed aliens with little Frankenstein monsters. In fact, the aliens were the little Frankenstein monsters. So Stooges did a lot with it.
Well, I think immediately of Spooks, of course, that being also significant because of having been done in 3D.
Yeah, Spooks is great. I love Spooks. My friend Bob Furmanek ran a print of that once, I think at Film Forum, and spoke ahead of it. He didn't do that restoration, but he was presenting for a lot of 3D films. And to see that with an audience in 3D is really something.
Sure. Sorry, you've got one in here that I have to ask about because it's not one that I've seen, and I know it's got to be one of the more obscure ones on the list, called Zombies on Broadway.
With the
team of Brown and Carney, who I only know from the little piece in Leonard Maltin's great book, Movie Comedy Teams.
Well, let's talk about that film because it's actually a great film, I think, and it has its fans. They were put together by RKO after Universal had great success with Abbott and Costello. They said, well, who do we have under contract? So we have Wally Brown and Alan Carney. So let's put them together. So they put them together, and they're not really Abbott and Costello. I mean, all the books and all the blogs and podcasts, it's RKO's answer to Abbott and Costello. But they're not really Abbott and Costello. They're kind of their own thing. They're kind of two funny guys. One's a little more goofy than the other, and that one also happens to be chubbier than the other. But the other guy, who would be the Bud Abbott, is also funny himself. Like, Bud Abbott was also funny, but Bud Abbott was a lot of times playing straight and feeding the comedy, whereas this guy gets off some of his own funny lines. You know, so it's not an exact match, but in Zombies on Broadway, they had Bela Lugosi in the cast.
These are the two subjects I was telling you about, Doctor. They got lost in the jungle and came here by themselves.
Subjects? Subjects for what?
Everyone on this island is referred to as a subject of the king.
Oh, ain't it a coincidence? Professor Hopkins at the museum in New York told us to look you up, and here we are.
Professor Hopkins?
Uh-huh.
Is he a friend of yours?
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, we're pals. We're just like that.
I hate him.
Oh, well, we didn't care very much for him either. He's a weird fellow.
And they had a real monster. That wasn't too common before Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Ghostbreakers had a real zombie with Bob Hope, and Zombies on Broadway also had a real zombie.
Jerry, I saw one. You saw one what? A zombie. He knocked me down over there. You're crazy. I had you by the wrist when you turned and ran. No, you didn't have me by the wrist. I certainly did. Now, this is no time to argue. Come on, we got to catch up with Gene. Jerry, please believe me. I saw a zombie, a dead man, walking. Now, listen, you didn't see anything. I was with you all the time. And if you did see a zombie, why didn't you grab him? That's what we're looking for. Now, come on.
So they were kind of trailblazers to have that in there. But the films, they move quick. They're fun. They're funny. They have interesting plots. They did two that were horror comedies, Brown and Carney. They did Zombies on Broadway, and they did Genius at Work. And they pretty much have the same cast in both movies. But yeah, that's a great one. It's ripe for rediscovery, and I think people would enjoy it if they could see it.
Yeah, this is probably as good a point as any to mention. A lot of the films that fall into this category and that we're talking about are readily available to watch on YouTube. I don't know if that particular one is or not. I haven't looked for that one.
It is.
But the next one that I want to mention is, and I just watched it, and I believe Jim just did as well. Similarly, you talk about Brown and Carney being a sort of, but yet different version of Abbott and Costello. Well, we get a movie called Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla, which is as much an imitation of Martin and Lewis as Billy West was to Chaplin, although mainly on the Lewis side. The Dean Martin was not such a precise comparison. But yeah, let's talk about that one a little bit.
Duke Mitchell and Sammy Petrillo turn an island paradise into the zaniest madhouse in the seven seas.
Okay, banga banga.
Since when do you talk a native language?
I just started today.
Well, what did he say?
What did he say? I don't even know what I said.
I love that film. And again, it's commonly listed on the worst films of all time lists, but I really love it. I love it because of two things. One, because whether intentionally or not, it ends up being a terrific send-up of another subgenre of horror comedy, which is kind of the jungle terror, where you could end up coming up against apes or jungle animals or mad scientists in the jungle or zombies. I don't think that.
Like Africa Screams.
Right, like an Africa Screams type of thing, but with a little more of a horror bent because you have the mad scientist. And
played by Bela Lugosi.
And doing the transfer, which is always another trope. Like, we're going to transfer this poor fool's brain into a monster or into a gorilla, in this case, which also ends up being the plot of a few Bowery Boys movies. But in Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla, again, you have Bela. So that's always a plus. And with Sammy, Sammy was a comic trying to get his act going. He was a kid. He was 17 when the movie was made. And at one point, someone told him, hey, you look a little bit like Jerry Lewis. If you got your haircut like him, you'd probably look just like him. So the legend goes. And so he got the haircut. Somehow he ended up teaming up with this guy named Duke Mitchell, who was a crooner. And, I wouldn't say Duke is an exact replica of Dean. It would almost be the difference between the California super handsome leading man type versus, a blue collar guy working in New Jersey type. Duke Mitchell leaned more towards that. He was a good looking guy, but he leaned more towards that more common everyman type. But he had the voice, the singing voice. And when you put him next to Sammy Petrillo, they looked like an ersatz Martin and Lewis. But I like the film. And not only do I like it because of it being that nice send up of the jungle films, but I like it because Sammy Petrillo, he's a kid. He's 17. He's not thinking big picture. He's not thinking, oh, I'm shamelessly ripping off this guy's act. You could see him thinking it. You could see him thinking through it as the film progresses. Like, how would Jerry react? But in a guileless fashion, not in I'm a ripoff artist fashion, but more like, oh, like I'm paying homage to Jerry, like a tribute. Like, what would he do? How would he respond to this situation?
So one thing he does is respond with Yiddish exclamations a few times that I don't recall Jerry ever doing in any of the movies.
No, well, he had some of his own kind of comic leanings that he brought into the proceedings. I got to meet him once and talk to him about a lot of it, and I have an article up on my blog about the time I met him. For people who want to read it, you could go to my blog and search Sammy Petrillo, and you'll see that. Actually, it's on the Third Banana blog, which was a blog a friend of mine did, but I linked to it. It's worth a read. But yeah, that's an interesting film. It's definitely an outlier, but a great follow-up to talking about Brown and Carney, for sure.
Now, in addition to the comedy teams we mentioned, another element during that era were series films. Blondie, Great Gildersleeve, Mexican Spitfire, Henry Aldrich, that sort of thing. Blending the horror or mystery in those types of films was also something commonly done. The one that immediately springs to my mind is Blondie Has Servant Trouble.
Yeah, that's a terrific one. That falls into kind of the old dark house category. How are you going to do better than having Arthur Lake as Dagwood there to be scared? So typical shenanigans, the revolving bookcase type stuff, freaky old house.
Blondie!
What is it?
The other room. He came out. Silk hat. I told him to put it back. He's gone.
What on earth are you talking about?
Baby Dumpling.
Couldn't you find him?
Sure, I found him.
Well, then.
But he disappeared, and Daisy... No, he came out of a room. He had a silk hat.
Dagwood, let me smell your breath. Now, what are you trying to say?
I found Baby Dumpling, but he's gone again now.
Well, he's probably around somewhere.
Blondie, you don't understand. He disappeared right in front of my eyes.
Great stuff. I love just the fact that the horror comedies became so ubiquitous that they ended up being not just part of the films of established comedians, but also became part of these comedy series. Just the titles alone make me laugh. Henry Aldrich Wants a House. Mexican Spitfire, She's a Ghost. Gildersleeve's Ghost.
Francis in the Haunted House.
Francis in the Haunted House.
Do you believe in ghosts? No? Oh, what fun you're missing.
They're trying to kill me!
Starring Mickey Rooney as that talking mule's valiant new sidekick. An eager beaver who gets roped into a murder mystery with a weird history.
Look, you all saw the ghost. That proves that I'm innocent.
It only proves you've got an accomplice. Francis, probably. Come clean. Was he the ghost?
Believe me, Francis could never ride a horse.
They're off at a killing pace with creeps and crooks, mayhem and mirth lurking in every secret catacomb and cranny. While Mickey's best girl puts the evil eye on him.
Francis, help!
But never fear. When the going gets too grim, Francis is near, reaching the seat of the trouble as only he can.
This is an election year. The opposition papers will crucify me.
Oh, what do you think they'll do if they're tipped you just lost a legal argument to a mule?
The titles alone make you laugh. And going in, oh, this is going to be great. They're going to get scared. So I love that it extended to that. And I'm very happy to include, reviews of those films in my book. It's been a while since I've watched them. Probably the one I watched most recently is the Blondie film, but even that was a few years back. And I just recall that there are some delightful moments in there. Sure.
The hidden passages and stuff like that makes it fun.
And I think it's a reminder to people that these series films had serious comedic talents in them and behind them. People can write off series films very easily. Oh, they just were cranking them out. They were filling the quota. They needed to be filler on the bottom of a double bill, programmers. But, they still have to take the time to write these things, think up the gags, and the actors had to be adept at pulling it off, putting over these things. Because especially when you're putting over fantasy stuff like this, you have to make the people believe that you actually believe you're seeing something that's scaring you,
Right.
And it's not easy. So I give a lot of credit to those series entries.
Yeah. Well, and then it seems like there was almost a transition between when you had a lot of those series comedy films, a lot of which came from Columbia. And then you get into the 50s and we start getting Roger Corman in the mix. And he's doing stuff like Little Shop of Horrors, Bucket of Blood. And then he transitions into the, I guess, larger budget, certainly, color, widescreen, Edgar Allan Poe influenced stuff. After he had launched his serious Edgar Allan Poe adaptations, then we're getting into The Raven, Comedy of Terrors, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Those earlier Corman films you mentioned for sure have comedic bits. I would put them more in a category of where things are starting to get more adult focused. They're a little more edgy, but they're really good. So I would have to give them at least a mention, if not full reviews. I don't think I'll be giving them full reviews for space constraints. But for the Vincent Price ones, just because Vincent Price and Peter Lorre worked so well as a Laurel and Hardy's, Abbott Costello type combination, I think that I'm going to include them. And I had previously reviewed the films for a book on Vincent Price. So the reviews are pretty much set already, but you can see where they were highly influenced by both of those duos. And Laurel and Hardy and Abbott Costello are different. They're not the same. A lot of people want to compare them all the time. And I always say apples to oranges. They're both great. I love them both. There's a fat guy and a skinny guy in both, and they're both funny. But other than that, there's a lot of differences. And it's funny to watch the Vincent Price, Peter Lorre films because they kind of pick a little bit of the best of both teams and throw them into the mix.
Yeah, and I just watched The Raven for the first time, as a matter of fact, and I noticed that I got a number of chuckles out of the film, but most of the things I was chuckling at were some of the visual gags, but one exception was a little bit of the back and forth between Vincent Price and Peter Lorre that I thought was amusing.
Oh, absolutely.
You got some dried blood off a bat in the house?
I beg your pardon?
Bat's blood. Dried or evaporated bat's blood.
No.
How about some chainlings from a gallows bird? Jellied spiders? Rabbit slod?
No, we don't keep those things in this house. We're vegetarians.
And that calls himself a magician.
And
I remember seeing that at the drive-in when it first came out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was hilarious.
Yeah, and the thing that blows my mind about some of those is they're written by Richard Matheson.
He was tremendous. He was so good. Major author, and screenwriter. But yeah, I guess he had a funny side too. We know he had a side for serious sci-fi and serious horror, but he had to laugh too, I guess. So,
yeah.
But speaking of serious and laughs and not always being able to go there, just about everybody did horror comedy in the golden age of Hollywood. Anybody who was a comedian in films. But there were notable exceptions. For example, Charlie Chaplin never really did a horror comedy. Now, his character could get rattled or scared by different situations, but he never went there. I think he kept that character pretty grounded, that tramp character. W.C. Fields, he never would have been rattled by a spooky situation, so you couldn't do it with him. And the Marx Brothers, they would have to be the ones perpetrating it, They would have to
scare the ghosts out of the house.
Yeah, exactly. So to me, those are the three huge exceptions. But I was very surprised at the number of shorts Buster Keaton did where he got scared. And there are still a number that I need to watch. But when I watched The Haunted House, I went in very much a skeptic because I said, well, he's the stone face. So how is he going to be scared? And by golly, he did it all.
Yeah.
Through his body language.
Yeah, his eyes. Yeah.
He did it through his eyes and his body language. That Haunted House is such a great short. Kind of typical of some of the silent entries. In fact, if you guys know Ben Modell and Steve Massa, they do the Silent Clowns. And they have their silent comedy watch party show once a month, and they do live events. And they once did a presentation, I think it was part of Silent Clowns, that they called Scares in the Second Reel. And a lot of the silent ones kind of start out with a setup in the first reel, whatever the situation is. Maybe it's a phony psychic. There was a bunch of those, especially with our gang. Or, the setup of the inheritance and the reading of the will and all that. And it would be the second part, the second reel, where all the spooky stuff would start happening. And that was very interesting. That was kind of an eye-opener, and Haunted House falls into that category as well. But yeah, these are all just films I love. And through the course of working on the book, I got to watch a number of things that I'd never seen before that were revelatory. For example, Columbia, we spoke about Columbia shorts. Columbia did a series of short subjects starring Hugh Herbert. Now, the majority of the short subjects that they made with Hugh were of the kind of domestic comedy of errors type, kind of the Leon Errol thing where the wife thinks that Hugh is stepping out on her with another woman, and it's all just mistake most of the time. And he did a lot of those, but then they did 4 spooky horror comedy shorts. And in those shorts, he was teamed. Even though it wasn't credited this way, he was teamed with Dudley Dickerson, African-American comedian, brilliantly funny guy. You could see him in Spooky Hooky, the Little Rascal short. You see him, I believe it's A Plumbing Will Go, the Three Stooges short. I think he's in there. He's in a lot of different things. But in these Hugh Herbert shorts, they're on equal footing. They're like a team, even though they're not advertised like that in the credits.
Well, we're going to blow this joint. You guys coming with us? Huh? You mean to tell me you're all through with everything in here?
Well, as much as we're going to be.
Right.
You don't think we're going to spend the night in this creepy joint, do you?
You're going to leave us here all alone?
Oh, you won't be alone. You'll have Ben's goats to keep you company.
That was a revelation to me to see that. He was given that much to do, and they let him roll with it because he was a brilliant comedian. So there are things like that that have been really exciting for me in researching and watching these films.
You know, it just occurred to me that somebody that didn't do a haunted house or scary comedy that seems like he would have been perfect for one, and that's Eddie Cantor.
Yeah, I think you're right. He did not. Joey Brown at the time got involved in some spooky stuff. There's an early Milton Berle film that has spooky stuff, but Eddie Cantor did not. Yeah,
he actually participates in a kind of a spooky-ish setting in Palmy Days, where he's the assistant to Charles Middleton's phony psychic.
Okay.
That's atmospheric, and he's part of the atmosphere in it, and that's my favorite of Eddie Cantor's films.
Yeah, there's all these outliers, like I said. We could talk all day and night about the comedians that are the top tier, everyone knows, household names. But you have to look kind of deeper on some of these things. For example, there's a film called You'll Find Out. And the stars of that film are Kay Kaiser and his band. Kay Kaiser, Ish Kabibble. And they're not technically film comedians, but they were very comedic on their radio show and did a lot of kind of comedy type musical numbers. And they have in the cast Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, and Peter Lorre.
Another seance? That's ridiculous, of course.
On the contrary, the suggestion of our friend Mr. Kaiser suits us beautifully.
Are you mad? There's no time to be wasted on Saliano's nonsense. We have to get rid of the girl.
But you forget it's much easier to arrange an accidental death downstairs than in Janice's bedroom.
Yes, but if I proposed another seance, it would surely arouse suspicions.
You won't propose it. Margot Bellacrest will demand it.
And I believe that's the first time that the horror actors were utilized in that way. And you get a number of films like that, where they would take these actors and use that. Actually reminds me of Arsenic and Old Lace with Cary Grant and Peter Lorre, because Arsenic and Old Lace, the play on Broadway, had Boris Karloff.
Yeah.
But what happened was the producers of that show locked Karloff up in terms of playing that role. They wouldn't let him play it in the film. They had him under contract for Broadway, and they said, we wanted this show to run as long as possible. We don't want you being in the film with us. We want you to be on stage doing this. So when they made the film, they had to hire Raymond Massey to play the role that Karloff played on stage.
Which is a shame, because it undermines the whole joke.
Go on down the cellar with him.
Gee, do I have to, Sarge? Look at that puss. He looks like Boris Karloff.
It undermines the joke. And really, if they had put a little more thought into it, they could have, it's still a great film, but they could have made it even better if they had thought, oh, what's Bela Lugosi doing? Let's hire him for that part. And then they still could have done the Karloff joke, because they were always seen as the two rival boogeymen, right? and it would have been like a fun, almost like an early meta joke. It would have been funny, I think, if they had done that. But one of the films I ended up watching for this project is a film called The Boogeyman Will Get You. It's a Columbia film with Boris Karloff and Peter Lorre, and it's pretty much a rewritten Arsenic and Old Lace with some tweaks and changes. They have Maxie Rosenblum in there, Slapsy Maxie. And it's almost like they must have approached Boris and said, well, we know you can't do Arsenic and Old Lace, and Warner Brothers has the rights anyway to the movie, but will you be in our film that's kind of a knockoff of it? And, it has its own charms. When you have pros like that in there, it's going to be charming. That's the thing. These films, you can assign them a star rating, and it doesn't matter because the audience going in knows they're going to see funny people getting scared, and that's what they want. And I could look at them and say, yeah, some are better made than others, and I'll give them a rating. But at the end of the day, my rating means nothing. You watch it, you either enjoy it or you don't. Even the ones I give lower ratings to, I enjoy. I mentioned Karloff just now. A good example is Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff. I give it like 2.5 stars out of 4, but there's great stuff in it because of Abbott and Costello, because of Boris Karloff, because of the supporting cast. There's elements to it that are great. It's just that the script is not fully baked,
Yeah.
So these things are what they are. But I think the fact that there were so many of these films and shorts made shows you just how popular they were. And I think that movie theaters liked them because they knew they could use them for matinee fodder too. Like years
Right.
later, a lot of these things would be re-released to movie theaters and later drive-ins. I mean, Bowery Boys movies were playing in drive-ins into the mid-1970s. I found an ad recently, touting one on the same bill as something like Marathon Man or something, and plus the Bowery Boys, and I'm like, okay, but I think theater
I
owners
mean, to see Hunt's Hall in the dentist chair.
Yeah, Hunt's Hall was great. The key to a lot of these teams and comedians that did a lot of the horror comedies was the quality of the scare take. Obviously, Lou Costello's scare take is just hilarious.
What's the matter now?
You know that person you said that there's no such person?
Yes.
I think he's in there, in person. I was reading a sign over here, this one down here, Dracula's Legend. All of a sudden I heard...
That's the wind.
It should get oiled.
There's actually a recent film from, I would say, the last 6 or 7 years. I think it's called The Nice Guys with Russell Crowe and Ryan Gosling.
Oh, right.
And if you watch this film, there is a scene where Ryan Gosling does the Costello scare take.
Yep.
Exactly. He
I
does
remember
the
that.
wheezing. He does the oh chick part. So it's a quality of scare takes. Hunt's Hall had great scare takes. Curly Howard had great scare takes.
Hey, old boy, you're going on a trip.
That's what you think.
Well, them's my orders, and when I get...
Shemp Howard had great scare takes. Obviously, Stan Laurel. So, I mean, if you could pull that off, that was just, a terrific thing.
Yeah. Something just popped into my head, and this could send us an entirely new direction here, but I figure it's worth mentioning because another place where you saw the blend of comedy and horror in this way, cartoons. I mean, I think
Absolutely.
of the Looney Tunes, Water Every Hair, and the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde Tweety cartoon and all that stuff.
Such an interesting monster. My stars, if an interesting monster can't have an interesting hairdo, then I don't know what things are coming to. In my business, you meet so many interesting people. But the most interesting ones are the monsters.
Countless cartoons. And again, going back to the silent era, you can find Felix the Cat, cartoons from the 1920s.
Oh, gosh, some of those are so surreal.
Yeah, and there's Spooky Situations, Coco the Clown from the Fleischer Brothers, Spooky Situations. They just keep going. Again, it's the same trajectory. It really kind of matches up with the live action films. It was endless. And actually,
if you've seen the Tex Avery cartoon, Who Killed Who, it's got a great take off on the body falling out of the closet bit where they just keep falling.
Ah, yes. Quite a bunch of us, isn't it?
It also has Fred Kelsey caricatured.
Right.
And Fred Kelsey was famous as the Hotel Dick, the hotel detective in the Laurel and Hardy murder case short. And he repeated the role. I believe it's in When a Body Meets a Body. Hopefully I don't have the title wrong. The Stooges short, which was primarily a takeoff on the Laurel and Hardy short. And he did the same role there and in other things too. But it looks the way it's like a dog, right? The dog in the cartoon is the detective.
Right.
But he's got the same bowler hat, the same cigar, and looks exactly like him.
Now we'll see who does it.
So yeah, for sure, the cartoons just kept all of that going.
Well, that provides a nice coda to our discussion of horror comedies. It's a fun topic, and it's been fun talking about these films. For any of you who want to do a deeper dive into them, pay a visit to Paul's blog, Scared Silly, and spend some time perusing his write-ups. Pack a lunch, because there's a lot there to see and absorb. Paul's blog can be found at scaredsilly.paulcastiglia.blogspot.com. And if you didn't immediately commit that to memory, just swing by the Movie Nights and Matinees website's featured guests page. Scroll down to Paul's picture, click on it, and faster than you can say revolving bookcase, you'll be at the Scared Silly homepage. And that brings me to my final question for you, Paul, which is the one I ask all of my guests. What is your most memorable movie-going experience? And it doesn't have to be connected to today's topic.
Oh, okay. I'm going to give you two, if I may. I'll keep them
It
brief.
happens.
Yeah, I'll keep them brief. Yeah, I'll save the funnier one for the end. But I will start out with one that ties into the topic, which is that I had a buddy in college and art school, and we'd hang out sometimes. And I remember one time we went to a movie called The Alchemist. This was a really bad, super bad, low budget horror movie. And I just did not like it at all. And then like a year or two later, we were getting together again. We wanted to see Stand By Me. This is when Stand By Me came out. So, back in those days, you could show up at the theater, it wasn't pre-ordering tickets or anything. You could show up and they would tell you, sorry, movie sold out. That show's sold out, Stand By Me was sold out. So my friend looks up at the marquee and he says, hey, look, there's something here called Night of the Creeps. We should watch that. And I had this PTSD flashback to The Alchemist. I'm like, oh no, this is going to be terrible, just like that was. But he convinced me, and we went in. And to this day, that film remains one of my favorite films. It's definitely my favorite horror movie of the 1980s, my favorite horror comedy of the 1980s. It was a big influence, as much of an influence as Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and the Night Stalker TV movie are on my Archie's Weird Mysteries comic book series. Night of the Creep was also. Night of the Creeps, I should say. It had everything. It has everything in it. It's just really funny, really well done.
I know of the film. I've never seen it. I guess now I'll have to.
Give it a watch. It's a mix of everything. It's just great fun. But the other story is the funny story, which we'll go on, which is about a film called The Gods Must Be Crazy. It was released in the United States, I think, in the early to mid 80s. And I wanted to see it. I had heard about it and it sounded funny to me. I wanted to see it. The film, for people who don't know, it's about this bushman who is just minding his own business one day and a Coke bottle gets tossed out of an airplane flying overhead. And the Coke bottle is kind of the first material object that his tribe has ever seen. It clonks him in the head. He brings it back to the tribe. They study it. They worship it. They then start to fight over it. They've never had, anything like fights or jealousy or anything before. They had this material object. So he says, the gods must be crazy. I'm going to walk to the end of the earth, throw it back to them, right? Throw it back to the gods, right? So I'm in the theater watching this film. And the film starts off like a legitimate documentary film. And it goes on for a few minutes like that. And this is all the setup, right? So at one point during the documentary portion, guy gets up and almost like a stage actor, like he makes a thing of it. He gets up out of his chair, he puffs out his chest and he says, The newspaper said this was a comedy. I'm getting my money back. And he storms out. And as soon as he leaves, the Coke bottle hits the Bushman in the head, and it's nonstop laughter from there on out.
Mm.
I just thought that was the funniest thing. I'm like, oh, you fool. You left, you left this film that is a comic gem thinking that it wasn't a comedy. So definitely my most memorable theater experience.
Well, I certainly hope none of our listeners headed for the exits that quickly because they missed out on all the fun. Incidentally, many of the films we've talked about are readily available to stream through various services, especially YouTube, which we mentioned earlier. Although I'm always an advocate of physical media, so you don't have to rely on the internet being up at any given time. Paul, we'll be looking forward to seeing your finished book, and for now, thank you for joining us on Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thank you, Bill and Jim. I really appreciate it.
As always, if you're interested in obtaining physical copies of movies we talked about, visit the screening room page on the Movie Nights and Matinees website, where you can click on the images to see their listings on Amazon and order them for your personal library. While you're in the neighborhood, visit the comments page and leave some feedback. Ask a question, offer some stock tips, whatever's on your mind. You can also do that at the Movie Nights and Matinees Facebook page, where there's the additional possibility of starting a conversation. For instance, what are your favorite horror comedies and why? And of course, if you like what you're hearing, please leave a rating where you listen and a review if possible. Speaking of which, in case you haven't already seen the post on the Facebook page, I'm happy to announce that this humble little old podcast made FeedSpot's October list of the best 25 film history podcasts, with a ranking of number 8. That's a pretty good spot to debut in, but I'm not content to rest on my stand laurels, so again, please submit those ratings and reviews so we can climb even higher. If you're a new listener, please hit the subscribe or follow button. Well, Halloween draws ever closer, so it's time for me to head down to the lab and begin stitching together episode 19.